Today is the 18th of July 2014. My name is Sherry Wong, and this interview is for the Ming-Ai London Institute British Chinese Workforce Heritage Project. Could I begin by asking your name?
Yes, my name is Elena Barabantseva.
Where were you born?
I was born in Minsk, Belarus, which was then part of the Soviet Union.
And what sort of education did you have?
I was educated firstly in Belarus, so I got my primary, secondary and undergraduate degree in Minsk. I graduated from the Belarusian State University in International Relations, and then I came to Manchester to do Masters in International Relations with the scholarship from George Soros Foundation, Achievement Scholarship. Since then I've been in Manchester, so I've been here since 2000. And I got my PhD also from the University of Manchester in International Relations.
So you've only ever been in Manchester since you've been to the UK?
Yes.
And how long have you worked in academia?
So I completed my PhD in 2006, graduated, and I pretty much started working straight away first as a postdoc. So I was part of a bigger project called British Inter-University China Centre. It was a consortium of 3 universities, Manchester, Bristol and Oxford. And it was a 5-year postdoc. And after that I became a lecturer. So the postdoc led into permanent lectureship post here at Manchester.
And what's your main occupation at the moment?
So I'm a lecturer in Chinese International Relations in the Politics Department at the University of Manchester. And it's in my role I do both research, so my own research interests, teach undergraduate, postgraduate students, supervise PhD students, and have administrative role as well.
So what motivated your interests in researching into overseas Chinese?
I think it's kind of like many things in life. It was somewhat accidental. I developed my interest in China and all things Chinese when I first started learning Chinese at the university in Minsk. It was my second foreign language, and we had a very passionate language teacher who nurtured this love for Chinese culture, Chinese language in all his students. So when I came to Manchester in 2000, I carried on with my interest. So most of my master's essays and my MA dissertation was also on a topic related to China. But more than China, I was also interested in the idea of what a nation is, what Chinese nationalism is about, how we came to associate China with mainland China, and how Chinese government, present, past, related not only to Chinese overseas, but also to populations which are not slightly different. They're not mainstream, not the same as the majority Han-speaking, Mandarin-speaking population in China. So it kind of was accidental, but it was also driven by this interest in different cultures, different languages, different religions, which all are in China, but sometimes not so overlooked. And I wanted to trace the development of this idea of Chinese nation and consequent policies, government strategies and discourses around the populations which are seen as part of China, although they are not physically located in China, so obviously Chinese diaspora, but also populations which are part of Chinese territory but are very different in many different respects. So that led me to research this topic in my PhD thesis, which will then developed in the book project, Overseas Chinese and Ethnic Minorities. So I was never strictly only became interested in Chinese diaspora, overseas Chinese. It was always in relation to China as a nation, as a state, in relation to what we think Chineseness is. So that's how I developed my interest in overseas Chinese communities.
Could you talk a bit more about your PhD and this group project and the key ideas in terms of Chineseness, as you put it?
Okay, so the project grew out of this interest of how Chinese modern kind of nation state came about, how we started thinking and conceiving of China as this stable monolith, as People's Republic of China, and how the government itself, not only the communist government, but also preceding governments, the Qing court and the Republican government, how in their political project they related to overseas Chinese and what ethnic populations meant to them, how they saw these groups playing a particular role in the Chinese state, in the idea of what Chinese nation is, kind of what Chinese culture is. So how this idea of who is in China territorially and who is outside China related. So I try to engage with the idea of territoriality. Particularly in my field, international relations, we speak of states as territorially, politically, culturally kind of stable units of analysis. While if you look at how the idea of Chinese state came about, the Chinese nation, Chinese nationalism, it actually grew out from the engagement activities with the overseas communities. So the conditions of work for Chinese coolies in plantations on the ships, then the state of the Exclusion Act in the US, when they were not seen as part of the American population, were not seen as a people of the secondary state, secondary citizenship. So what they were lacking from the perspective of Chinese politicians, Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionaries, they were seen as the driving force of modern idea of China, the kind of revolutionary idea of China, how they should contribute to what Chinese modern state project is all about. And then if you juxtapose it with the role of ethnic minorities, then they always downplayed. They were always seen as populations which were lacking development, lacking education, as backward, kind of slowing down the development of China. So for me, it was interesting how overseas Chinese were always perceived to be at the forefront of where China was heading to, and ethnic minorities as those who were kind of slowing down this process of modernization development. And so these are some of the kind of, in a nutshell, ideas which I was trying to develop in the book.
Do you think this kind of concept of using overseas Chinese as, pushing development, has that changed over the years?
No, I think it's still very much the case. From the perspective of the Chinese state, the Chinese overseas are still seen as kind of model Chinese citizens. They're the best people who represent China kind of on the world stage. They are the representatives of the Chinese nations, and the whole the reputation of China as such depends on how overseas Chinese are perceived, be it Chinese students, Chinese workers, Chinese businessmen, Chinese tourists. So they're seen as representatives and also people who kind of China would be judged on how they perceived in these countries. Mm-hmm.
So let's current research about Manchester's Chinatown.
Yeah.
Could you talk us through a bit of the history of the Chinese community in Manchester?
Okay. What's interesting about Manchester Chinatown is that it didn't take the same development routes as other Chinatowns in the UK. And I know you've done research in London and Liverpool, and these are excellent examples of how Manchester Chinatown is different, because in Liverpool, the oldest Chinatown in Europe, the Chinese community, Chinatown grew out of the Chinese settlements. So people, it was seamen, Chinese seamen who were living in Liverpool, and then the idea of Chinatown or ethnic enclave developed around that. And the same in London, Limehouse was where originally Chinatown was based. Also, people lived there, and then Chinatown grew out of these settlements. In Manchester, the development was of opposite nature. There was no settlements, kind of close settlements of Chinese migrants in Greater Manchester. There were no seamen as such, seamen communities. Early migrants to Manchester in the early 20th century, late 90s, early 20th century, were laundrymen, and subsequently they were taken over by Chinese takeaway restaurant owners. And because of the nature of these occupations, they were scattered around the city, so they were never living next to each other. So the Chinatown didn't grow out kind of naturally from the communities, but it was a conscious effort on part of the Chinese business leaders, restaurant owners, and Chinese authorities in the late 70s, 80s to create a sort of urban area which would represent Chinese community in Manchester, also play a role of kind of represent Manchester as a multicultural city, because in the 80s multiculturalism was a very powerful, very influential idea in urban development, in urban planning in the UK. So, and how Chinatown developed here was part of this broad discourse on multiculturalism in urban planning, and similar developments took place in Birmingham, Glasgow, and that's where London's Chinatown, where it's now, also started development, took off the ground. So that what makes Manchester different. But what's also makes Manchester different is this vibrant kind of community scene. Another point is that what I found in my research, that a lot of people, Chinese Mancunians, they take a lot of pride in Chinese community in Manchester. They perceive themselves as the most successful, the most kind of forward-looking, diverse community in the whole of the UK. So before, especially when I interviewed older generation of Chinese migrants in Manchester, they were saying that they always felt they were lagging behind Liverpool, and they perceived Chinese community in Chinatown in Liverpool as a competitor. And they were talking about their life in Manchester in the 70s, so there was nothing here for groceries. They had to go to Chinatown in Liverpool. But then it changed dramatically in the 80s, 90s, and now they feel that they're much more ahead. They managed to develop very successful community centres such as Wayin, which is now seen as a model community, not only in Manchester but in the country. Manchester Chinese Centre, they've developed several very successful projects, such as oral history of Chinese, it's Manchester Chinese Archive. So they also gathered a lot of oral materials and artifacts from the Chinese migrants in Manchester, and then created an exhibition in Manchester Science and Industry Museum. Then Art Centre. So there are although they were never part of a very cohesive community, there were a lot of activities around Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese education going on in Manchester, which developed into something different. And I think many Chinese people here in Manchester feel that it makes Manchester special and successful in this regard.
So with the establishment of the Chinatown back in the 80s, was there a lot of support from the council, the local council, in this?
Yes, in the 80s, although I've never interviewed people from the council, I relied on some archival materials and newspaper articles. And from the conversations with the Chinese migrants and those who were at the beginning of Manchester Chinatown developments, they said that it was a partnership, so partnership between Chinese community representatives, but also Manchester City Council, that it was seen as a development which would benefit both parties. But however, in the 90s, the 2000s for sure, there was a feeling that the City Council is not interested in investing, developing Chinatown anymore. So when I interviewed people in 2011, there was not resentment, but a lot of dissatisfaction with how City Council now sees Chinatown. They see that it's kind of exhausted its potential, that they could do everything they could do, and now it's up to the community and the businesses there to reinvigorate Chinatown. So in the late, I can't remember when, 2007, 2008, there was a Chinatown Action Group established. And the aim of this organization was to lobby City Council to do something about a negative reputation of Chinatown in Manchester.
Did you interact with many people?
A bit. I didn't interact for a long time, but I interviewed the leader of the Chinatown Action Group. I went to a couple of meetings. So, yeah, I'm kind of familiar. I don't know where they're up to now, but the arch has been recently renovated. So,
how do you think this has affected Chinatown and the Chinese community then? Have you seen any major changes because of this lack of support?
Well, I don't know what's the major development which I've noticed, and what I ended up writing about, that a lot of communities moved out of Chinatown. So the original organizations which were established in Chinatown in the 80s, including Huayin, Chinese Arts Center, MCC, Buddhist Center, they all moved out. And when I was interviewing their representatives about their moves, they were saying that that's because the neglected state of the buildings in the area, that the property prices, the rents going up, and that they just ran out of space. And it actually gave, I think, it redirected the focus of the organizations and helped them to develop into something new, something more substantial, I would say. And the way they talk about what community means to them, what the aims of the organizations are, it's very different. So for Huayin in particular, I found it very interesting that now they even dropped the name of Chinese from the title of their organization, just Huayin Society, because they've exhausted kind of the title doesn't represent them anymore. That they work, what they do, what they offer is much more than just engaging with Chinese women and elderly. And the same goes for Chinese Arts Center. I did some research with them, and they did interviews, and they were saying that the move from Chinatown actually helped them to expand and change the perception of what they do. Before, when they were based in Chinatown, people who would go to this center would expect to see a particular type of culture, art represented, but while now it helped them to establish their reputation as a center for contemporary Chinese art.
So let's move on to talk about your documentary film.
Okay.
Called British Born Chinese.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us a bit more about where this idea came from and why you chose to make a documentary like this?
Okay. So this documentary grew out of my interest in the relationship between urban space and community, and what it is to have a space, Chinatown, representing a particular community, such as Chinese community in Manchester. But so initially the film was conceived as documentary about the history, developments around Chinatown, and what it means for Chinese in Manchester, and particularly new generation of Chinese here. But then it developed into something different, like many projects do. They take on their own lives. So initially we started with Chinatown, and we went to Chinatown on Chinatown Cleaning Day. It's an initiative by Manchester Chinese Centre every year before Chinese New Year celebrations. Kind of mobilize Chinese community children to tidy up, to pick up the rubbish, and just make sure that the place is nice and tidy for the parade on Chinese New Year Day. But when we went to the Chinatown Cleaning Day and met our characters, we interviewed them about their relationship with Chinatown, but it emerged to us that they don't really spend that much time there. They just go there for particular events, occasions, such as Cleaning Day, but most of their lives evolve somewhere else. And because we started focusing on these two boys, the film took us to other parts of Manchester, which also tells something interesting, important about Chinatown and this link between Chinese community and Chinatown that doesn't really exist. So we've been working on the film for almost 1.5 years, almost 2 years, and it's not finished yet. But the idea now, the idea of the film is to understand what it means for a second generation of Chinese migrants to grow up in a British city such as Manchester, what it means to be British-born Chinese in the 21st century Britain.
Maybe we'll talk a bit about the focus of the film and the two boys. You said you have these two characters. Yeah. So if you could explain a bit about what kind of story you're telling through their life.
Okay. I'll talk more about the idea, how it's developed in the film, but I won't give away kind of the message, because it's open for interpretation. There is no one way of understanding, reading the film. But so we worked in the collaboration with Manchester Chinese Centre, and got access to these boys through their parents, through the director of the Manchester Chinese Centre. And when we got their permission to work with the boys and secured boys' interest in working with us, we kept it very kind of open-ended. We thought we'll see what are the real concerns the boys have, what kind of issues they encounter in their everyday lives. So the first phase of the film last year, we just followed the boys on kind of community events, Chinese New Year celebrations, charity events, their life at home and in the center. And this year we introduced a slightly different level of engagement with our characters. We gave them our camera, and we asked them to just record their daily life, what happens in their lives and what's important to them. And so the ideas which we engaging with, it's not something we think is important. We hope That's what they see as important. The themes emerging. It's the question of identity, the question of kind of generational attitudes to Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese heritage, and also race and discrimination and bullying at school. These are the main themes which are developing.
So why did you choose to focus on British-born rather than overseas, from Chinese-born?
Okay, it's chance. I think we didn't really have any kind of preconceived idea who our characters are going to be. So I didn't know when we went. The idea, kind of the research-driven idea of this film is that we keep it as open as possible and see where our characters will take us. And because I work with visual anthropologists, and they have this very strong ground in an ethnographic approach, we don't have kind of a strict research agenda. We work out it as we go along. It wasn't something we planned to have British-born Chinese rather than Chinese students or new migrants to Manchester. It's just happened that we had these boys, and I had no idea that both boys' parents are also takeaway owners. But I thought, wow, that's interesting, because it actually gives us an opportunity to unpack this stereotype that most Chinese migrants in the UK are actually takeaway owners or catering business in one way or another. So it just happened this way.
Yeah. So with your interactions with these boys and perhaps any other British-born Chinese, what have you kind of learned about this?
The most striking thing I found out was that they still, although they were born here, they've been growing up in the UK, socialized in the kind of education system, culture, social circles. They still feel very much not fully belonging in this country. And for me, it was the biggest discovery that they feel they still don't quite fit for one way or another. And that the way they are treated by the immediate social circles, not family, but outside family. At school, still the idea of race is very, very present, and they don't feel that they completely belong in this country, in this culture. That was the biggest discovery for me. And so what we're trying to explore in the film is how they address this issue. What are their kind of techniques to overcome it, to deal with it.
Having studied citizenship and migration, what do you think the key issues are for migrants from mainland China who move to Manchester currently?
Well, there's a too big, I think there's many dimensions of it. There's a British kind of citizenship system and what it means to be British citizen, but there is also this link with China and how China perceives overseas Chinese and their role in Chinese nation, Chinese project. There are many kind of conflicting, not only discourses, but also processes people have to engage with to make sure they kind of get on with their everyday lives. Well, I'm not going anywhere with this question, partly because it's not the focus I've been researching, but I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to associate yourself with one particular community. It's almost impossible, and particularly if you work with people of migrant backgrounds, be it first generation, second generation, they don't have one loyalty. They don't have fully belonging to one particular place. They have multiple connections, multiple affiliations. They don't feel like they have to be rooted in one particular place. And with our boys, what I felt, sometimes they feel torn apart by these numerous demands placed on them by their parents, their community, their school. So, and they don't quite know how to navigate it, how to balance it out, because it's just too much. All these claims made on their behalf.
In your research, did you come into contact or interact with many people migrating from mainland China?
We have lots of students, so I do interact with lots of Chinese, mainland Chinese, but mostly students.
And do you think they face similar issues, or are they a bit different?
I think even more so. They have probably even more issues because of how the education system works, especially undergraduate and postgraduate levels. The way the curriculum is developed, it doesn't really help international student who doesn't understand what's expected of them, how British system works, to make most of it. It takes a long time just to understand what it means to write an essay, what is expected from a research essay at the graduate and postgraduate level. So it's one level that we don't, I think for a lot of students from mainland China, it takes a lot of time just to get to grips with what it is to write a good academic essay, because it doesn't exist, something like that doesn't exist in China. But on a more kind of cultural, social level, I think there are a lot of obstacles existing at the university level and the wider society for them to feel part of this picture, of this environment, of this culture. And we often blame people for not making enough effort to integrate or to kind of socialize. But I think the biggest obstacle lies in the mainstream society, and the prejudice we hold against people who come here.
So that's all the questions I have. Is there anything you'd like to add or kind of go over at this moment?
No, I think it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.